Good morning, class, and happy April Fool's Day. This is the lecture on Arab military regimes. And just a note for you, if you looked at the guide questions and terms earlier than Tuesday, that is yesterday, then you need to look at it again because it's been updated. I made a few additions of terms and places, and then also one correction of a spelling mistake I made. So, this is a follow-up, actually, to the lecture I gave on Monday on the rise of Islamic political movements and the ideologies. And so today I want to examine why these Islamic movements became more radical over the period of the late 20th century. And to do that, you have to look at the military regimes. And they dominated the Middle East. I'll come back to that in just a minute. And just a personal note is that I lived in Egypt from 1972 to 75, 72 to 75, 3 years. So that was the period of transition for Sadat from more of a socialist style economy to what he called a freer economy. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then again, I lived in Syria in the academic years, 1979, 80, when I was doing my research for my PhD. And that, as you'll see, was a very turbulent year in Syria's history. And then I returned to Syria for another academic year as a postdoc. So I was working on a second book at that time. Was already at Wesleyan and gotten tenure at Wesleyan. And so I was in Syria from 1989 to 1990, which also was a very turbulent year because that was the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had been the major backer of Syria. And I left Syria by the time the Saddam Husayn invaded Kuwait that summer. But tensions were building in the region before I left. So I witnessed those kinds of tensions. So in part, this is a kind of a personal story for me, but it also is important to understand the 21st century. So first, we want to start off by talking about military regimes. Ostensibly, every Arab country, and here I'm going to talk about Turkish military regime on the next lecture on next Monday. But in the Arab world, the Arab states, and there are 21 or 22 of them that are in the Arab League, they're divided in between republics and monarchies. And the monarchies, the most famous of the monarchies are, the ones you've heard of are Morocco, which has had a king whose legitimacy stretches back. He claims to be descended from the Prophet's family. There was a monarchy in Libya that was overthrown by Colonel Gaddafi. And then the surviving monarchy, so it's also a monarchy in Iraq, which was overthrown by a military regime in 1958. And I have a timeline. I have a list on this sheet of various presidents of various military states, so you can check those. You get confused on what I'm saying. So Iraq lost its monarch, and so Jordan remained a monarchy. There were various attempts at times, but Jordan still is a monarchy. He has a king. He is a Hashemite, so his legitimacy goes back to the clan of the Prophet Muhammad. In Saudi Arabia, there's a monarchy. There is the House of Ibn Saud. And then you have monarchy in Kuwait and Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, and also then the Sultanate of Oman. So basically, the Arab states along the Persian Gulf are all monarchies. And all the other Arab states are technically republics. Now, the only one that has consistently been a republic in a sense that it had parliamentary elections, political parties, a relatively free press is Lebanon. Since Arab Spring in 2011, Tunisia has joined those ranks. It has had a troubled time since 2011, but it has consistently had a relatively free press and free elections. So it joins the ranks. And ironically, Iraq, since the American occupation, starting in 2005, the Iraqis have had relatively free elections, and they can be seen more as a true republic than they had been previously. So previously, the other Arab states, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya after the revolution, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. Those are all what we call military states that claim to be republics, but which rarely functioned as republics in the sense that they allowed political parties, had free elections. What they did have from time to time is what is known as plebiscite, that is a national vote. And generally, these are votes of approval for the president or the change in constitution. And typically, the results will be 99.9% of the population says yes. So they're not actually very fair and free, but that they maintain all of these Arab military states maintained the outward appearance of being a republic with a parliament, with elections, like we would think in a parliamentary republic system. All right, now the question is why? Why did the Middle East have these military states? And that's a harder question for me to get to. I'm not really sure myself. And there are multiple explanations by political scientists on it. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian. So I tend to look at things in the long view. And again, I'm going to remind you that this lecture is going to have a lot of dates and names. They're not really that important for you to learn. I think the important things that you should take away from every lecture, look over the questions that I ask, and if you can answer those questions, then you've come away from the lecture with the information you need. Remember, the final will be 2 essays, and you'll have a choice, which there'll be several options, but you have to write 2, and they will be looking at the long view of the Middle East, basically from 1950 to the present. So back to why military regimes. One is the context of the Cold War. And I had mentioned to you earlier that in the Middle Eastern countries, especially the Arab countries, the military tended to be drawn from the lower middle classes because the upper classes tended to go into commerce, into things like doctors, lawyers, professions. And so the peasants, largely drawn from the peasant classes, their sons went to the military academies. So the military in the Middle East tends to be populist. That is, it's drawn from the poorer elements of the society as opposed to Latin America. In Latin America, the officer class was almost entirely elite. And so in the Cold War, you have the United States supporting military regimes in Latin America, which are seen as pro-capitalist, anti-communist, and Soviet Union promoting or backing military regimes in the Arab world as being anti-American, pro-socialist in their ideology. So that's one of the factors. So international aid. These regimes would not have continued to exist without support from outside sources. Their military capabilities, they just didn't have it. So in the case of the monarchies import weapons first from Britain, but after the 67 war, increasingly the monarchies are supplied by the United States. The republics are supplied by the Soviet Union. The big critical difference is Egypt, which I'll talk more about today, is after it signed the peace treaty with Israel in 1979, America, the United States, became the major supplier of the Egyptian military. But the point is that these military regimes would not have had the kind of life that they had without the supplies and support from the great powers. So that's one thing. The second, as I said, they did have a popular base. All of them do come from the people. And so having said that, they all then also have, once the people are in power, there is a system of patronage that the people the closest to the regime are the ones who get the benefits, especially in the states, first of Egypt until 79, and then in Iraq and Syria, the states tend to nationalize everything. I'll talk about them in each case. But that means that if you want to get to control of factories or banks or whatever, you become friends of the prime minister or people in his around him, and then you get the contracts, you get the jobs. And so there's a lot of patronage that is flowing out because most of these, all three of these republics, the largest sector in the employment is the state sector, either directly or indirectly. And I'll talk more about that, especially when I talk about Egypt, what I mean by indirect. For example, well, we'll get to that later. And so some Arab political scientists call this system Neo-Mamluk. The Mamluks were a group of soldiers that were in charge of Egypt and Syria from 1250 to 1517. And they had cliques of their own. And so it wasn't family, or they weren't dynastic, but they were, they would be equivalent of coups against each other. And whoever was in power would then give out patronage. So that Arab political scientists have tended to call these days Neo-Mamluk, in the sense that the Arab world had experienced that kind of regime in the early modern period or the medieval period, where military men dispensed wealth, patronage, and wealth tended to be concentrated among the military. The outside of the Middle East, political scientists have coined the term kleptocracy, which I have added to your list. If you Google it, you may not get a word. It's a specialized word that's often used only for Middle Eastern regimes. But if you think about ocracy, we know that, kratia, rule, and klepto, you know it from kleptomaniac. So a kleptocracy is a government run by thieves. And that's what basically these military regimes are. They come in with a popular wave of support from people. They generally mark a revolution. They tend to supply services to the most needy in the country, so they have a base of popularity. But once they're in power, they increasingly use terror and the threats of imprisonment and torture, death. And remember, especially the ones that are linked with the Soviet Union, they are borrowing all of the interrogation techniques of the KGB, or in Syria, it was Stasi. So in Syria, the East Germans, secret police called the Stasi, Staatssicherheit is where it comes from in German, state security. They are the supply, the training for the Syrian secret police. So these are as one Iraqi dissident called them, a republic of fear. So they are a republic in name, but in practice they are, well, the Soviets were republics as well. So if you think of the Eastern European model of the way they were governed under the Soviet period, it's very similar in the Arab countries. The difference is that there is more of a family connection in the Arab states, with the exception of Egypt, but in Syria and in Iraq, it's definitely family. So I often invoke another model for American students. Think of the mafia and how the mafia clans operate and intimidate and then spread out both threats, but also rewards. And that's what is short how these countries operate. So now what I'm going to do is make a break. You can take a break here if you want to, stop it. And then talk about the three cases, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And they all play out differently. And in part, they play out differently because of the makeup of their populations. So in some ways, Egypt is the easiest. It's the clearest in explaining it, because Egypt, basically, there are two populations in Egypt. There is the Sunni Muslim population, which is about 90%. There's no census, so Christians tend to claim they're more, Muslims claim that Christians are less. So there's a Sunni Muslim population and there is a Christian population, almost all of whom belong to the Coptic Church. And so that's COPTIC. It is a Eastern Rite church, so they have their own hierarchy, they have their own patriarch. Their only connected church is the Church of Ethiopia. They share a patriarch. The Patriarch of Alexandria is also then the patriarch of the church in Ethiopia. So we call it the Coptic Church, and the people are called Copts. That's like a cop with a T on the end, so C-O-P-T-S. So Egypt's population is basically, they look the same, they speak the same dialect, the culture is very similar. The Copts, for example, don't eat pork, so they maintain more or less, they do drink alcohol, but they don't eat pork. So they're very similar, the way they look. The names are different, obviously. Muslims have Muslim names, Christians, we should say. But that would become, we'll see, the fracture point. It wasn't a fracture point under Nasser, and it wasn't even a fracture point too much under Sadat. It's as the Islamic movement becomes more extreme that the Christians then become the major target of the extremist movement. And that differs quite widely from in Syria and Egypt, where there are other kinds of cleavages. The other thing about Egypt is that the army draws in people from all across the country. It is largely a peasant army. And the officer corps is drawn from all across the country. So we saw, I mentioned to you earlier, Sadat looked African, had a lot of African ancestry. So the poor, generally African-looking Egyptians are considered the lowest on the social scale. So you had a guy of partial African descent, Nubian. The Nubians are the African people living in the south of Egypt. He rises to the top. Both Mubarak and Nasser were originally from peasant families, were from peasant villages. So the military is a popular institution in a sense that it comes from the people, but it also is popular in the sense that the people feel that the army represents them and will protect them. So that's a key difference. But even within that, the people who are in the army, especially the officer corps, they have opportunities for wealth that the rest of the population doesn't have. Because although Sadat announced that he was going to move away from the socialist controlled economy that was the Nasser era, Nasser had confiscated the banks, he had confiscated factories, confiscated any modes of production were confiscated by Nasser and taken over by the state. Now this period, and I have to correct it on the sheet. I corrected on the sheet for you. I have it as, it should be Infitah, I-N-F-I-T-A-H. And that means opening up. And so Sadat, after regaining American recognition in the 70s, opened up Egypt supposedly to foreign investment. But basically what happened is, yes, some foreign investment came in, but it had to have Egyptian partners. And most of those Egyptian partners were then from the officer class. The factories and the other kinds of means of production were privatized, but they often, again, went to military class. So you get a situation in Egypt, it starts in the 70s, but it becomes really wide scale in the 90s, is that the army becomes not only the institution of the military and defense, but also a very important economic force. It's estimated that in Egypt in the 21st century, that the army controls as much as 10% of the GNP. For example, most hotels are owned by army officers. Beverage production is owned by army officers. The whole concrete industry is army officers. And in this way, I think the only other parallel I can think of in the world is China. And in China, you have then the development between the party and the army, and the party has some economic bases, resources, and the army has others. And they then sometimes are in conflict, and that probably one day will be a problem for China. But in Egypt, there is no equivalent of the Communist Party. There is no political party that represents the government. And in fact, under Sadat, he allowed for a number of political parties to function, including the Muslim Brothers. And so the Muslim Brothers come out of the shadows in the 1970s, and they then pursue what we will call the democratic path toward a Muslim state. And that is, they start to, as I say, organize. They run candidates for elections. They had kept a very powerful infrastructure, even under Nasser, partly because women were rarely imprisoned by Nasser. And so the brotherhood shifted to being a sisterhood, and women took on a lot of the active roles, the political roles in the party, the movement, and also under Nasser, the social services that the brotherhood offered the Egyptian people didn't decrease. So they continued to be active in charity work, feeding the poor, giving out small loans, and things like that. So they had a base that could be energized quite easily into a political movement. So the government tends to, in the 70s and the 80s, when it does allow elections, it tends to monitor the party, the Muslim Brothers, and also then to limit the number of seats they can get. So they always have a representation, but it's usually a relatively much smaller than their numbers would have. Had it been a totally free election, they would have probably already taken over the parliament. So that, and they then increasingly say, they have a simple slogan. It says, Islam al-Hal. So Islam is the solution. So Egypt is in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the 21st century. It has a burgeoning population. Now it's up to 100 million. It has almost no resources other than land. And as the population grows, then the amount of land doesn't grow substantially. There is some reclaiming of drier areas under Nasser and early Sadat, thanks to the high dam in Aswan. So there's more irrigation water available, but it doesn't keep pace with the population. And so what the government does is the government offers jobs to people, and they get a minimum salary. Every college graduate is offered a job. And to get a sense of the despair in Egyptian society, I think the best, for an American, the best way to get at it is a novel. And I've listed it on the list, on the sheet here. It's called Yaqubian Building. I won't spell it out because it's on the list, by Allah al-Aswani. And it's a novel that's been translated into English. It's available in paperback, so you can probably get it. I know you can get it on Amazon. And it also was made into a movie. And in fact, it was Egypt's most popular movie. I don't think the movie is accessible to Americans as is the novel. But if you do want to watch the movie, you have access to some kind of streaming service. It probably is there. It actually opened in America for a while, so you wouldn't have to go to an Arabic language streaming service to find it. It's available. When it is available in the US, it's available with subtitles. But I recommend you see that because he captures the kind of economic quagmire that Egypt was in that helps to give rise. So in Egypt, following the assassination of Sadat, which I mentioned last time in 1981, you get a real split in the Islamic movement between the Muslim Brothers, that is the people who are what we'll call constitutional Islamists, who believe that the long road is the way to get to power through the ballot box. And then you get the others who say that that's too slow, they need to galvanize a revolution. So these are people who are influenced very heavily by Sayyid Qutb. The need to, remember, the group that kills Sadat is called Takfir wa Higra. Takfir, remember, is what Sayyid Qutb reintroduces from the medieval philosophy of Ibn Taymiyyah, that Muslims can call other Muslims kafir, and therefore those Muslims lose their right to life. They could be killed, and that justified then the killing of Sadat, and then also setting up settlements in the desert where they could train and prepare for the revolution. So this group then is organized under what's called the Jama'a al-Islamiyya. It's on your list. Jama'a is the Egyptian pronunciation of Jama'a, which means organization, and that is all. It's a name that's used throughout the Muslim world. You have it in Algeria, you have it in Pakistan. It means different. It has different. They're not always as radical as this Egyptian group. The Egyptian group in the 80s is very radical, wants a revolution. And one of their leaders is, I didn't put this on the list, but he'll show up on when we talk about American involvement in Iraq after 9/11. And that's Ayman al-Zawahiri. So just remember the name, Ayman al-Zawahiri. again, you'll see it in print later, so don't worry about it right now. You don't even have to worry about it later because it's not going to be on the exam. But he was in the Gamal Islamiyah. He then goes and joins Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. So there is a clear link between the Gamal Islamiyah activities in Egypt and in the 80s and the 90s, and then their participation in al-Qaeda. So the Gamal Islamiyah then starts to terrorist attack, and it attacks the military and the police, but it also then attacks tourists. So there's a number of very ugly attacks against tourists in Egypt, and then they also increasingly attack the Christians, especially in southern Egypt. In southern Egypt, the Christians in Egypt are largely rural. They live in the southern part of the country, much more higher percentage than the northern part. And in all the villages, the mixed villages where there are Christians and Muslims, there are attacks by the Gamal Islamiyah against churches, against Christians, and there's quite a bit of a sense of terror. And you get a wave of Christian Egyptian immigration to America in this period. There are I would say probably well over 100,000 Copts that came to America in the 90s and the early 2000s from Egypt, and they were able to come in as political refugees because of the terrorism that was being conducted against Christians in rural Egypt. So that is what we'll talk about basically with Egypt. So Egypt then, the military is increasingly aligned with the United States. The officers go to America to train. American, depending on whether it's Democrats or Republicans under Bush administrations, for example, America didn't really care that much whether Mubarak was allowing democracy as long as he Egypt remained in the peace treaty with Israel, and Egypt cracked down on the Islamic militants in Egypt itself. So that was the main bargain. We'll bring it up later. At the end of this lecture, we'll talk about the first American war with Iraq in 1991. And that's a turning point for all of these regimes, obviously, especially for Iraq. But I'll talk about that at the end of the thing. So for Egypt, then, I just want you to take away with is that it is relatively stable on the surface with Mubarak, and then later when Mubarak dies, I'm sorry, Husni Mubarak stays till the end. I wouldn't say that Husni Mubarak then stays in from 1981 until the Arab Spring. So he has a very long period of running the show. There is, as I said, there is a loosening up of some political. The Waft Party comes back into play. There is a looser control over publications, but there still is control. And the state itself is moving more and more toward trying to look more and more Islamic. The society itself is moving more and more Islamic. When I lived in Cairo in the 1970s, you rarely saw a woman wearing the hijab. And remember, the hijab is a scarf that covers your hair, so no hair is visible, your face is visible. If you're more extreme, you wear what's called a niqab. A niqab is a veil like this, so it goes all the way down. Some really extreme groups have complete veil, so you don't even see the eyes. But most of them, it covers you, so the eyes are visible right above the veil. Now that's mistakenly called burqa by a lot of people, especially those in France. The burqa is actually an Afghan garment. It's a cloak that comes over the whole body and then has a face mask that looks like a lattice. So you got the, like this. So you look out like you're looking through prison bars. That's a burqa. So the face veil is not a burqa, technically, it's a niqab. And so back to the hijab. Hijab was almost, I never saw a hijab on a woman's head, or rarely saw it on a woman's head in Egypt, Cairo, in 1972, 1975. 1975, when I left, the Sheikh al-Islam, the Azhar, the leading Muslim cleric in Egypt, is the head of the Azhar University. He was asked, what is the proper dress for a woman, a Muslim woman? And he said that they should cover their hair and they should wear a coat that would cover their exterior down to their mid-calf. They don't have to wear gloves. You'll see a lot of very Islamist women wearing gloves. Gloves weren't part of it. But it was the idea of decency. What is Islamic decency for a woman? And I was told, I didn't go back to Egypt until 2012. I was told that by Egyptian friends that almost immediately Muslim women in Egypt started wearing the headscarf. And when I did go back in 2012, every woman I saw was either wearing a niqab or a headscarf, or if she wasn't, there were a few, it was obvious they were Christian. Obviously, sometimes they actually wore crosses outside their dresses to make sure you knew they were Christians. So it had become a universal. So there is a growing Islamic sense that we have to return to this kind of outward appearance of Islam that is spreading across the Arab world in the aftermath of the 73 war. Sadat had said that the reason why Nasser lost was because of Arab socialism. The reason why Egypt won in 73 was because Islam was there. Islam was on our side. And that had resonance. Nationalism was losing appeal. Sadat changed the name back to Republic of Egypt. So in Egypt, especially after signing the peace treaty with Israel, Egyptian identity became focused on Egypt. Egypt is Egypt. Yes, we speak Arabic, but we're really Egypt. And that kind of played into, Egyptians have a kind of sense of superiority anyway. They think they're the best in the Arab world. They speak the best Arabic. They have the most culture, all that. So they have they're sort of the Texans of Egypt. They think everything about Egypt's best. And so, sorry if I offended any Texans in the audience, but that's how, especially my generation, how we viewed Texans. Texans came across as being very boastful that Texas was best. And so Egyptians came across that way in the Arab world as well. Although people watch their movies, watch their soap operas, they often felt, dealing with Egyptians, that the Egyptians had a sense of superiority. So it played into the Egyptian sense of self, that they were special, they were Egyptians. But then the Muslim part of being Egyptian becomes more and more important. The secular notion of Egypt, as I mentioned Taha Hussein's idea, that no longer, why they're proud about the pyramids and the pharaohs, that isn't seen as a real, it's just part of the past, it's not part of the present, and that our Islam is really what it makes us special. So that, in that sense, that Islam, and then if you read or watch the movie Yaqubian Building, you'll see that there's a young guy in the book who kind of embodies this youth that go to college but there's no jobs, and so they then become more and more radicalized because Islam is in the air. So people, their study groups, people go to mosque a lot more than they had been going. And so Islam then becomes a kind of way of dealing with the economic malaise that Egypt experiences pretty much from 1980 on. There is no boom in Egypt. And so Islam is comforting to people. And then if you feel that the state isn't really doing enough, and you do see corruption, and the corruption is all around you, you then say, well, let's go to this more radical way of dealing with the state. All right, so let's set Egypt aside. And then the next one I want to talk about is Iraq. And in Iraq, it is more complicated because Iraq has a complicated population. In the northern part of Iraq, in the Iraqi mountains, it's called Kurdistan, and the population is entirely Kurdish. That is, they speak a separate language from Arabic. It's more closely related to Persian, although it's not, Persians can't understand it. Kurds can often say they understand Persian. Persians can't understand Kurdish when it's spoken, but they're close. So think of, say, Spanish and Italian, or Spanish and Portuguese. They're close, but they're not the same language. So that's the mountain people. They're tribally organized. You get down on the plains, in the northern plains, the population is Arabic speaking and Sunni. And in the south, they're Arabic speaking and Shia. So from Baghdad south, Baghdad is mixed itself, it has Sunni Shia. North of Baghdad, most of the Arab population is Sunni. South of Baghdad, it's almost entirely Shia. In addition, you have a Christian population, especially in the north. It's small in Iraq, about 5% before the American invasion. And you also then have a Turkmen population. Turkmen are people who are descended from Turkish tribes that moved into the region starting about the 1500s. They speak a Turkish language. It's very close to Turkish spoken in Turkey, and they have a separate identity. Now, they're scattered in villages, but they have one area where they were the majority, and that is the town of Kirkuk in the north of Iraq. In 1920s, they were the majority population there. But Kirkuk becomes very important in the story of Iraq because that's the first place, 1927, that oil is first commercially produced. Oil had been coming up in Kirkuk, and local people had been selling it for centuries as fuel. Not as fuel oil, as lamp oil. But the British start to exploit it in 1927, and then the population shifts. That the Turkmen population is still there, but bring in thousands of workers to work in the petrol industry, and they're from the countryside, and the countryside is Kurdish, and so that then leads to Kurds claiming that Kirkuk is their city, and I'll talk more about that in another lecture. But so there's a mixed population. So under the monarchy, which was again a Hashemite monarchy, remember it's established by the British in 1922. The monarchy is pretty much patronizes everybody. It tends to work through the old established, the tribal leaders, through the urban groups, urban families that were prominent. The Shia tended to be a little bit less represented, but they're there too. But in 1958, you get a army overthrow the monarchy. And if you look on your list, that is Abdul-Karim Qasim, 1958. Remember, 58 is the year of the Arab Socialist, the Arab Republic, UAR, Union of Arab Republic, United Arab Republic, and the idea of a United Arab State. Well, Qasim takes over, but Qasim isn't a Nasserite. He's not even a Ba'athist. He's very much influenced by the Communist Party. And so he institutes a dictatorial regime that lasts until 1963. And during that time, the Kurds are included with the coalition because the Kurds they had been involved in the Mahabad Republic. So they had already experience with communist ideology. Communists were recruiting in the Kurdish region. And remember, there had been this incredible guy that I told you to watch out for. He's kind of the Forrest Gump of Middle East history, and that's Mustafa Barzani. He was an Iraqi Kurd from a very prominent family, the Barzans. And he went into the Mahabad Republic. He then fled when the CIA helped the Iranian government overthrow the Mahabad Republic. He went to Soviet Union and then Czechoslovakia. And he then, when Qasim comes to power, he's allowed back into Iraq, and the underground Kurdish party was called, in English, the Kurdish Democratic Party, or the KDP. He becomes the head of the KDP, and the KDP and the communists then are in coalition with the military during the period from 58 to 63. That's a period when they undergo massive confiscations of property by the state, and also then the nationalization of the oil companies, which had been run by the British. And so oil money becomes an important part of why the Iraqi government can continue our military regimes can stay in power in Iraq, is because they have the resources. They control the petroleum, which is the main resource. I would say probably, although Iraq has agricultural land, Iraq could industrialize. It doesn't. I'll talk more about this when we talk about the curse of oil as well as the blessing. And so the Iraqi economy all through the 20th century after the revolution looks a lot like the Saudi economy, and the GDP is 90% oil. Oil is the wealth. There's no industrial development. Agriculture is minimal. It tends just to feed local consumption. There is a service industry. There is obviously some retail, but not much, because most of the retail is in the hands of state-owned stores, as in the Soviet Union. And so there isn't a mercantile middle class that's prospering from this oil. So oil then is the key. Now, the dynamics then from 58 to 63, it is pretty much a class thing. For example, there is not long after the military takeover, there is a riots in the northern city of Kirkuk where Kurds attacked Turkmen. Now, later people say, oh, this is ethnic, but there's been a recent study that shows that actually it's not as much ethnic as it is economic. The Turkmen had been the old merchant families in Kirkuk under the Ottomans. When the British came, they were much more likely to be recruited as the higher ups in the oil company. The Kurds came in and were the day laborers, not educated. And so there was a class dimension to this violence as well. And so 58 to 63 is a period when especially the Kurds see as an opportunity to become more and more a part of Iraq. Something they kept arm's length during the monarchy because the monarch was a Hashemite who was very much an Arab, himself was an Arab monarch. The Qasim regime, appealing to communist solidarity kind of thing, it's class versus ethnicity. But in 63, there is a coup, and the first of the group is al-Salam Arif. He's then succeeded by his brother. And then you get Ahmad Bakr takes over in 1968, and then he is succeeded by the infamous Saddam Husayn. Now, all of these men are from one city, Tikrit. It's north of Baghdad. It's on the Tigris River. It is a Sunni Arab city, and most of the elites then in Iraq from the time of Arif on are what we call Tikritis. They are people from Tikrit. So they are Sunnis. But there are other Sunnis, there are other Sunni towns, and those people, they might have minor roles in the government, but it's basically, you can think of the Tikritis as the mafia. They all are interrelated because of cousin marriages and things like that. They're all the families from Tikrit, most of them anyway, have some connection to all the other families. And so they're a very close-knit group of people. You're saying, well, how big is Tikrit? Well, it's about 80 to 100,000 people. So it's a sizable number. It's enough that they can survive. There are others who are brought into the regime. And it's notable that the regime, the Ba'ath, and the key thing, the difference I didn't mention is the key difference between Arif and Bakr and Saddam Hussein and Qasim is they are Ba'athist. So that is, they do believe in socialism, but they believe in Arab nationalism is the priority. And so under the Ba'athist regime, the Kurds are includingly excluded, as are even the Turkmen. And the Shia, though, aren't. There is no, the Shia tend to keep arm's length from the Ba'ath, but there are Shia in the Ba'ath party higher echelon. There are Shia there. They are underrepresented, but they're there. And the really anti-Shia kind of turn in the Ba'ath party, which is characteristic of late Saddam Hussein, doesn't come until the Iran-Iraq war. And I'll talk more about that toward the end of this section, but more even when we get to talking about the rise of a political Shia ideology in another lecture. So under the Ba'ath regime, the Kurds are increasingly persecuted. They start open rebellion. The Kurdish Democratic Party starts an open rebellion. It splits into the main group is still the Kurdish Democratic Party, but you also then get what's called the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, or PUK. And I'll talk more about that later. You don't need to have it in this lecture, but it splits that, and that does cause some problem for the Kurds, and that especially the PUK tends to be the urban Kurds, the Kurds that are educated, they know Arabic, and the KDP tends to be the tribal Kurds up in the mountains, the ones who probably don't know Arabic, haven't had much schooling, and are very traditional in their outlook and loyalties. So The war is pretty deadly, and at one point the Iraqis even used poison gas against the Kurds in the north. Not as bad as they would under Saddam Hussein, but still there were limited uses of poison gas. And finally, in why is that the Iranian government, the Shah's government, is supplying the Barzani with weapons, and Barzani then carries on this guerrilla war against the Iraqis until 1975. And in 1975, the Shah offers the Iraqi government a deal, and it's known as the Algiers Agreement of 1975 because the two-party Iraq and Iran meet in Algeria to make this deal. And the deal is basically the Iranians won't supply the Kurds with weapons anymore, and the Iraqis then will recognize that the Shatt al-Arab is split between Iran and Iraq. The Shatt al-Arab is a river. I have it on your notes, so I won't spell it for you. The Tigris River and the Euphrates River both flow out of Turkey. They flow into Iraq. The Tigris River is more to the east. The Euphrates is more to the west. And the area in between is the old fertile Mesopotamia. Land between two rivers is literally what Mesopotamia means. And so the two rivers, and they then flow together. I'm not sure what the mileage is, but it's not a long river. They flow together, and that's called the Shatt al-Arab, which literally means the coastline of the Arabs. And that then was the border in the south between Iraq and Iran, and it flows into the Persian Gulf at Basra. And Iraq, when they carved out Iraq, the British carved out Iraq, they left Kuwait, which had predated it. I'll talk more about that in just a minute when I talk about the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. The British had carved out most of what would have been the coastal Iraq. So coastal Iraq is, I think, 20, 30 miles at most. And Basra is the only town. So under the treaty that established Iraq and between Iran and the British mandate, the British government, the Shatt al-Arab was given entirely to Iraq. That meant that Iraq, it was considered an internal waterway for the Iraqis. Under the Algiers Agreement, it was split between Iran and Iraq. That meant that the Iranians who were developing their major oil is on the other side of the river. That area could export through Basra as well, out through that port. They could, oil tankers could go from there. And that saved them some money because otherwise they had to ship it by pipelines to closer to Persian ports on the Persian Gulf, which were further away. So that ended the Kurdish insurgency for a while. Barzani hid in the hills, basically. He would go from time to time to Turkey, from time to time to Iran, but basically he stayed in the hills, and eventually, though, he would come to America. And as I mentioned in the lecture on Iran, our American influence, he ends up dying in America. But his movement continues. His son, Masoud, is the head of the KDP today in Iraq. But that ends the Kurdish problem. Now, Bakr hands off leadership to Saddam Hussein in 1979. That's the same year as the Iranian Revolution. And Saddam Hussein then sees the weakness of Iran, the fact that many of the officers were executed by the Shah. A lot of the officers who weren't executed fled to the United States. He felt that it was the perfect time to move against Iran. Now, why did he do this? Remember, 1979 is the year that Egypt and Israel signed a treaty. So he wants to make the claim that he is the new Nasser. He issues a public biography, which is a total lie, which says that he made an attempt during the Qasim years against a major official. He was shot in the leg by the bodyguard. He then fled in a taxi from Baghdad to Jordan, which you could do. There's a long highway that connects the two, and there are taxis that run between the cities. And then once in Jordan, he went to Egypt. And in Egypt, well, he had the surgery. The surgery he did himself. According to the biography, he took his knife and he cut out the bullet in his leg in the taxi. And then he was treated in Jordan, and then he flew to Cairo, where he was a student at the University of Cairo, and where Abdel-Nasser let him stay in his apartment, and he lived with Abdel-Nasser for a year. Now, this is completely a lie. As far as we know, he never left Iraq. He, unlike a lot of the military leaders, he didn't speak a foreign language. He never left Iraq. But he wanted to make this link that he is the new Nasser. All right, so the Egyptians have dropped out of the confrontation with Israel. So what Saddam Hussein claims is that, yes, there are Palestinians, Arabs, there are Arabs living under Israeli occupation, but there are many more Arabs living under Iranian occupation. Now, if you cross the Shatt al-Arab, you hit a province in southwestern Iran. If you look on your map, the mountains go around it. So it is flat. It's like Iraq. It's on the Persian Gulf, and that's where almost all the oil fields of Iran are. The major town there is Abadan, which in Arabic is funny because it means never, 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 Abadan. But in Persian, it means something else. It means flourishing, place of flourishing. And the province was historically called Arabistan. The regions in the Persian-speaking world usually are by ethnic groups, and you add Istan, and that means the country of. So we talked about Kurdistan, the country of the Kurds, Arabistan, the country of the Arabs. So, Persians had always acknowledged that most of the people living in that region were in fact ethnic Arabs. They're Shia, Muslim, but they're ethnic Arabs. So the Shah had changed the name in the 50s to Khuzistan. Khuz in Persian means sugarcane. And so it now means the country of the sugarcane. So he didn't want the ethnic identity there because it was obviously tempting to Arabs then to claim that this was Arab territory under foreign occupation. And that's exactly what Saddam Hussein said. He said, this is Arab country. Millions of Arabs are living under Persian rule. The Arabs haven't liberated the Arabs of Palestine, the other Arabs, Syria, Egypt, haven't liberated them. I'm going to go over and liberate these Arabs, and that's going to be a great victory. So you can see this kind of bombacity. This is the greatest thing ever, right? The greatest thing, the greatest, great, everything's great. And I'm going to make a great victory for Iraq and the Arab people generally, and I will prove that I am the new Nasser by doing this. And so he invades Iran, and there is initial success. The Iranians aren't prepared for it, and the Iraqis get as far as Ahvaz. But what they find is that rather than the Arab population rising up in victory, right, they're going to celebrate us, just like we said, the Americans said that when we invaded Iraq, the Iraqis were going to celebrate our arrival. Well, Saddam Hussein said that the Arabs of Khuzistan or Arabistan are going to celebrate our arrival. They didn't. They fled, like people do. When you invade, people flee. The Iranians are able to mobilize their population. The mullahs, the preachers, went out into the schools and recruited. I had a very good friend in graduate school who was Iranian from a village. He was out at the time of the revolution doing graduate work, and his rest of his family was back in Iran. And he had, I think he said 7 brothers. Of those brothers, they all volunteered to join the campaign to defend Iran against Iraq. The mullahs, there were videos showing the mullahs going into schools with machine guns and a book and say, which would you prefer, the gun or the book? And of course, teenage boys say, the gun, it's excitement. And so they go off. And this friend of mine, he lost 6 of his brothers, died in this war. So it's a tremendous war. The Iranians has basically sent wave after wave after wave of fighters against the Iraqis, and just wore the Iraqis down. The air power, neither side really had the jets. The Iranians had a problem that many of the pilots had left. The Iraqis just didn't have the training. They had jets, but they didn't fly them that much. So it was a war fought on almost like World War I, fought along the trenches, and then rockets. The Iraqis had rockets that they had got from the Russians, and they shot these rockets into Iran, hitting civilian targets, cities. Tehran was hit a couple of times, but more damaged were the cities along the border, near the border. So the city of Kermanshah, which is in the mountains on the border with Iraq, was heavily damaged. And I was in Kermanshah in 2000 and I guess it was 2014, and there still is damage there from the war that hasn't been rebuilt. So it was a massive war, dragged on. The people tried to negotiate, but Khomeini refused. He said it was a war of total war, and we're not going to stop until Saddam Hussein is killed. And so the war went on, and during the war, the Iraqi government is increasingly on the defensive. The Kurds in the north, who had started to rise up again on the side of the Iranians, started to attack the Iraqis. And so Saddam Hussein unleashes what is one of the most vicious campaigns in late 20th century history. It is, I would say, it's almost the equivalent. Well, it's worse in ways, but it's like the Serbs conducted in Bosnia against the Muslim population there. Saddam Hussein starts this campaign against the Kurds. It's called Anfal. It's on your list. And it was a campaign, one, to deport Kurds from Kurdish regions, to move Arabs in. So to deport Kurds from mountain villages, move Arabs into that. This especially took place around Kirkuk for obvious reasons, that the Iraqi regime wanted to Arabize that region because that's a major source of oil. It's not the main source anymore because oil was discovered in southern Iraq in the 50s. And most of Iraq's production actually comes from the Shiite areas in the south and not from Kirkuk. But Kirkuk still had oil. And so it also is on a plain. So it's easier to get people in there. They don't go up in the mountains. So the Kurdish villagers there were dispersed to the desert. And many of them died in the transport, and then lack of supplies in these new camps for them. And Arabs were given their villages. Other places, the Kurds are actually exterminated. The use of poison gas was used frequently. Various towns became infamous because they were gassed by the Iraqi regime. And the whole process is, we think, at least 100,000 people died. It may have been much more, but maybe as many as 500,000 were displaced by it. But it is then the kind of ending of the Iraq-Iran war in terms of the last campaign that the Iraqis did was not against Iran, but rather against the Kurds living in Iraq. So what stops the war is that in 1978, Khomeini dies. There then is a ceasefire between the Iranians and the Iraqis. And Saddam Hussein then has to figure out, how am I going to recoup my losses? And so he looks to Kuwait. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had heavily supplied, gave money, billions and billions and billions of dollars to Saddam Hussein during the war to buy weapons to fight the Iranians. Toward the end of the war, the Americans were supplying Iraq not with weapons, but with military intelligence, telling them where the Iranian forces were. Also during this time, we had one of the really terrible incidents where American jet shot down an Iranian passenger liner over the Gulf, and everybody on board, 200 and something people, were killed. So again, another black mark against Iran against the United States, that Iranians remember Americans aren't even aware of, unless you were alive at the time. You're not aware that happened. So back to Saddam, he needs this. He's $100 billion in debt to the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, and he says to them, I'm not going to pay it. You owe it to me. I saved you from the Persians. If not for us, they would be in your countries. In addition, it turns out the Kuwaitis have dug wells from Kuwait territory that go underground into the Iraqi oil fields and are sucking Iraqi oil out and are selling it. So there's a lot of reason of hatred for Kuwait on the part of the Iraqis, and this is when they start to say it's the 19th province, that it shouldn't have existed as a country because it's really part of Iraq. That is a completely bogus claim. It's about as bogus as Saddam Hussein saying he was the house guest of Nasser. Because if you go back, Iraq did not exist in the Ottoman period. It was 3 different provinces. Kuwait did. Starting in 1775, the royal family of Kuwait, and I'm going to name them and then I'll spell it for you, but you don't need to know it unless you're just really curious. They're called the al-Sabah family. So that's A-L-S-A-B-A-H, al-Sabah. It's the same word in Arabic as morning. So the al-Sabah family are recognized by the Ottomans as the governors of Kuwait in 1775. And that was recognized by the Ottoman state all the way down to 1918 when the British occupy Iraq. At the time of the British occupation of Iraq, the Emir, or the Prince, leader of Kuwait, signs a treaty with the British, which recognizes British protection over Kuwait, but Kuwait's sovereignty. So Kuwait at this time didn't have oil. It had, its people were famous for being fishermen and pearl. They found pearls in the Persian Gulf and they caught fish. And it was a very poor country. They would discover oil in the 50s and increasingly became a very rich country. But initially it's a very poor desert country protected by the British. So the claim that Kuwait was a part of Iraq was completely bogus. Yes, when the British drew the borders, it hurt Iraq that Kuwait wasn't part of it because it gave Iraq a very narrow waterway, and that was heavily shelled by the Iranians during the war. And Iraq felt, well, they needed a port that was further away from Iranian front lines, so Kuwait would do just fine. So for whatever reasons, the last part of the story is that the American ambassador was called in, a woman named April Gillespie, was called in to Baghdad by Saddam Hussein, and he said, well, Iraq we have interest in Kuwait. And April Gillespie evidently said, well, we recognize that, or something to that effect. According to her, it was non-committal. According to the Iraqis, she seemed to say, I don't care. Whatever the reason, Saddam Hussein then invades Kuwait. I don't remember the date. Either it's August, I think it's August 1st. August 1st, 1980. And of course it falls without a shot being fired. The Kuwaitis are famously seen on TV fleeing in their Mercedes and their BMWs. They flee out of Kuwait. Almost the entire Kuwaiti population leaves the country, which leaves behind the large number of Arab workers who were there, largely Palestinians. So the Palestinians did most of the technical work in Kuwait, and the Egyptians did most of the poor work in Kuwait. So that then sets up a crisis and will lead to the first American war with Iraq. So I will talk about that later. But it also then leads to, another lecture. It also leads to an opportunity because Egypt then comes in to say, I will protect Kuwait, I will help liberate Kuwait. And as we're going to see in just a minute, Syria is also forced to move radically at this time. So that is a major turning point again, and like I said, I'll talk about that in the lecture when I talk about American wars. So we'll switch now to Syria. Now in Syria, the hardline Ba'ath come to power in the mid-60s. As I mentioned earlier, the army corps in Syria was purposely recruited by the French to be from religious minorities, especially the Alawis, but also Druzes and Shia were recruited. So although the army is made up of everybody, the officer corps itself is largely these minorities. Now, the army then also socializes everything starting in the 60s. The large land estates are taken over by the government, and then the land are distributed to the peasants. There is quite a large, unlike Iraq, there is a relatively healthy industrial sector in Syria, mostly producing food products, processed food products, and textiles and clothing. But there is there, and also banking. That's all taken over by the state. And so who is dispossessed in Syria with the rise of the Ba'ath are the middle class, especially the Sunni middle class in the cities of Aleppo and Damascus, but also the Christian middle class is to some extent dispossessed by the rise of the Ba'ath. And who is improves are the peasants. So the peasants, although the peasants, Sunni Muslim peasants are overwhelming the majority of the population, The Sunni Muslim peasants aren't directly profiting from being in the army. They all serve in the army, but they're not the officer corps. The government does spend what resources it has, and Syria discovers oil in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. It has oil production, so it has that money coming into the state. Some of that's siphoned off for the kleptocracy, but some of it does go for improvement. So land is distributed to peasants, there are clinics set up, schools set up, and more importantly, there is a big dam that's built on the Euphrates. It's called the Thawra Dam, the Revolution Dam, and it then creates a big lake, and it's used for irrigation and electricity, and more land is open to agriculture, and so peasants are given land up in the northern part of Syria that then becomes Syria's breadbasket. It's fertile land, it doesn't have any water, but it's fertile, so once you bring the water to it, it can be very productive, and it does become a major source of, Syria becomes self-sufficient in food and water in this period. So there is some low-level prosperity, but back to these Sunni middle class and upper class who are dispossessed, they are increasingly portraying the regime as a sectarian regime, that is a Shia Alawi regime. In 1975 or 4, you have to look in your Cleveland Burton book for the exact date, Syria rewrites its constitution, and it says for the first time, there's no mention that the president of the republic has to be a Muslim. That's seen by the Sunnis as a sectarian move, a shift away from what Syria had been a fairly tolerant republic, but the constitution had stipulated that the president of the country should be Sunni Muslim, as were roughly 70% of the population. So that leads to the Muslim Brothers are in Syria, have been in Syria, but they are secret. They never were allowed any shape or form the kind of freedoms they had in Egypt, so they were a clandestine movement, mostly among the upper middle class. And there have been many Syrians who had gone to Europe in the 50s to work like the Turks did in factories. They became especially strong in West Germany. The Muslim Brothers, the Syrians in West Germany were very heavily influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, and they then started to organize and send money, resources back to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And so in the late 70s, late 70s, you start to see an Islamization of the cities that, again, women start to wear hijabs. They're not allowed to wear niqabs by the state. In fact, there is a famous campaign where the Girl Scouts of Syria, which are basically a paramilitary group, go into the covered market of Damascus and rip off if any women are wearing niqabs, they rip them off, but even headscarves, hijabs, they rip them off, saying that those are un-Syrian. So there is an aggressive policy by the state against this growing sign of Islamification. So Muslim women show that they are identifying with the Islamic movement by wearing the hijab, men by growing their beards. Historically, Syrians, almost no Syrians had beards. They all had mustache. We used to call this the Bath mustache. Every Bath man had a mustache. The beards were the outward sign of the hijab for women, beards for men, and people started going to mosque more. The Syrians had not historically been a super religious people. A lot more alcohol drinking in Syria than any other Arab country I've been in. For example, they didn't eat pork, but they were more lax on some of the other things. Mosque attendance became much more rigorous. Why? One, the secret police are also drawn from the minority, so they're not familiar with how mosques work. Mosque people know who the Muslims in their communities are, so it's very hard to infiltrate into them. And so the mosques then become the center of dissemination of Muslim Brotherhood ideology among the Sunni population. And then in the summer of 1979, now this is the summer I'm getting ready to leave the United States and go to Syria, the brothers stage a very dramatic attack on a military academy in Aleppo. Most of the students in the military academy are Alawis, so they're rural boys from mountains to the west of Aleppo. and the gunmen go from classroom to classroom and machine gun the students at their desks. And the number, again, I'm not sure, it's about 100 are killed. And that's the beginning of the uprising. The uprising is first concentrated in Aleppo. Aleppo had a very conservative Sunni population, much more conservative than Damascus, which was much more international in its outlook. And so the simmering, and it was in Damascus as well. I arrived in Damascus in September, and I was there through the summer, the next summer, and there were increasing incidents. You would hear bombs going off. You know, the Soviet Cultural Center was destroyed, bombed, because the Soviet Union was seen as a friend of the Syrian regime. They were supplying them with weapons and with money. I had a friend at the time who worked for the United Nations, a Swedish woman. She told me she was up in the north in Aleppo, and she was told by Polish people that they got a knock on the door in the evening. They were scared. They went to the door. There was a guy with a beard there, so clearly he was a brother. He said, "Don't worry. We know you're not Russians. You're under Russian occupation too." He's referring to the fact that Poland was part of the, under Soviet system. And also Poland was already, you had the beginning of the Solidarność movement, the Solidarity movement. So they were clearly anti-Soviet. At one point, somebody tapped me on the back when I was walking down the streets of Damascus. I turned around. The guy said to me something that was in Russian. And I said to him in Arabic, Afwan ma bahki Urusi. And I'm sorry, I don't speak Russian. And he patted me on the back. He said, in English, "Where are you from?" I said, "The United States." He says, "Good guys," and walked off. So they were targeting Soviets as well as state actors. And it got very, very increased. I left that summer of 1980. I went to Turkey to do more research, which is another story about the sort of dark horse bringing revolution from one place to another, because not long after I got to Turkey, there was a coup there. But I'll talk about that next week. But the violence continued, and finally in 1982 in the town of Hama, which is a very traditional, very heavily Sunni, also Christian though, town. The Alawis had moved into Hama. There was some industry there, and they lived on the outskirts of the town. And then one morning, I don't remember, I think it was spring in 1980, the mosque started to say, it's time to kill the Alawis in the morning prayer. The call to morning prayer says, time to get up, say your prayer, kill the Alawis. And so there was an attack on the Alawi section of the city. A number of Alawis were massacred by the brothers. And then the state came down like a ton of bricks on Hama. It literally surrounded the city. It shelled it. It had an old city that was on both sides of the Orontes River. That was completely leveled by the government. We don't know how many people were killed. The low number is 10,000. The high number is 25,000. But a whole section of town was completely destroyed. And that pretty much put the end to the uprising. But it left the Syrian regime with the lesson that the only way that any kind of insurrection can be quelled is to be with extreme violence. And so we'll see when Arab Spring comes, that's why the Syrian regime, or one of the reasons the Syrian regime acts with such violence. And I'm about ready to close out here. But one of the other things that happened was that the regime realized that it had to start to woo the Sunni middle class back. And so they began to ease restrictions. So by the time I got to Syria in 1989-90, 10 years later from my original visit, the government had allowed Sunnis to rent out property. Private property was recognized, and not only that, they could rent it out. So I rented out an apartment from a middle class, upper middle class, had been a formerly upper class, middle class Sunni family. Restaurants, they were allowed to open their restaurants. Before, the restaurants had been categorized into 3 categories. There were kebab places where all they did was sell grilled meat. There were Arab places, and there were French places, which sold French and Italian restaurants rather. And the menus were printed up by the government, and you had to cook the food on the menu. You couldn't cook anything you wanted to cook. And the restaurant employees were state employees. By 89-90, like as in the case of Cuba now, the restaurants have been privatized again. So restaurants, some hotels have been allowed to open private. So the government was trying to woo over the very people who had been the hardcore of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the 70s. They were trying to woo them over through economic liberalization. And I have to say it had some effect. Sunni Muslims that I had known in 79, 80, who were very anti-regime, in 89, 90, were less so. Of course, people are always worried about who they're talking to, but they seemed to be less. They were more interested in pursuit of profit than they were of overthrowing the regime. And then this is the big turning point for Syria. In the Russians start collapsing. The Soviets pull out of Afghanistan in 1989. And so when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, Syria sees that, well, it's not sure the Soviet Union is going to be a patron. Maybe we can get the Americans. And so, interestingly, Syria joins with the coalition of the United States, and we'll talk about that more in another lecture. But so Syria is starting to move a little bit toward the West because of the uprising and because of the shift. Soviet Union is no longer supplying it. You saw some graffiti, I saw some graffiti in Damascus in that period there that I was there, 89, 90, which is the period of the fall of the Soviet Union, especially Romania. Romania had been a major supplier in Syria because of the oil industry in Syria and the oil industry in Romania. And so when Ceausescu fell, the dictator of Romania, there were lots of graffiti that were up around the city saying things like Ceausescu first, Asad second, or even more obliquely, Shamsescu. So you would take the Ceausescu and put Sham in front of it, and Sham means Syria. So Shamsescu would stand for Asad. So there were these, you saw some, but it was pretty much suppressed by the secret police. And the middle class continued to have, there were nightclubs that were open by this time. There was a lot of loosening of the boundaries that had been imposed by the early Ba'ath regime. And so Syria then joins, and there were serious negotiations at that time that Syria would sign a peace treaty with Israel. And I'll talk more about that in another lecture. So I've gone a little bit over here. But I know you can break it up. You can watch it at different times. As I said, the questions are the key part to take away, not the particular names of the dictators. I think you should remember the key differences of the military in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, the composition of the military, and the way they're viewed by the state, and also then the different way the Islamist movements move. And we haven't mentioned the Islamist movements in Iraq. As I remember, I told you they're not that important until this period of the Iran-Iraq war. So when I give a lecture on the emergence of political Shia Islam, I will talk about this period in the Iraqi context. So this is it for today. I hope you're still staying well and that your online education is continuing. And I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.